Howdy, students. Good to be with you again. We're still holding on the overall average of downloads at 415 of the Bible studies that we're having so far. The last 3 weeks, I'll have to say, are closer to 350. Still very good group, but I think what's happening is that people are lagging behind and people are catching up all the time. I went by yesterday afternoon to look at our new offices, which are really complete, except for the driveway and getting in. We should be moving next Friday, and I'll spend part of Sunday packing my office. We're all a little daunted with the move itself, but we're really looking forward to being in a new place. Kim, more than most of us, because she could reasonably walk to work. 3 of our folks now actually live in White House who work at the office, so they are very pleased to have work closer to home. We'll have quite a bit more room, and it's much better organized, so we should be considerably more efficient than we have been. So far, I've only gotten one suggestion from you folks on how I can manage to be out of town for the move. David Whitcomb in England wrote and said, "Greetings, Ron. May I suggest a reason to be away from Tyler for a couple of weeks? Claim that the Pope has called you to Rome to seek your advice on the Bible." Anyone who knows you well, I think, would swallow that one. Well, maybe. Thanks for the suggestion, David. Right now, it looks like I'm stuck right here. Neither the Pope nor the Queen are likely to ask for my advice. Next week, you won't get an email with a link to the Bible study, but it'll be there. What you'll have to do, go to the front page at borntowin.net, look in the What's New section, click on the link for the weekend Bible study. You'll come to the page and you can select this one, and if you're running behind, you can go back and listen to some of the others as well, or do a little review if you feel like it. So that's where we're at right now. We have one question about last week's Bible study that I'll go into. It's from Charlene Pritt of Canton, Georgia. In the last Bible study, you talked about giving money to parents who are in need, and if there's anything left when you give, then you give to the church. I don't know if that's exactly like I put it, but Charlene goes on. My question is about the tithe. Is the little old lady on Social Security supposed to tithe first and perhaps not have enough money to buy medicine or food? Well, of course not. As far as I know, even the strictest of ministries that teach tithing have by and large said that Social Security is exempt from the tithe, that doesn't really fall in the category of what's tithable in the Bible. But again, that's your decision that you have to make. I've been asked, Charlene says, I've been asked this question, I don't know how to answer it. What's the right thing to do about tithing? Do you pay your bills first and then give to the church, or do you tithe first and then have enough to pay all your bills? Well, the first thing, the passage in question is not about tithing. I'll go back to it. It's Mark 7, verse 9. He said to them, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of God in order to observe your own traditions." This is from the NIV, by the way. "For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and anyone who curses his father and his mother must be put to death. But you say that if a man says to his father or mother, 'Well, whatever help you might otherwise have received from me is Corban,' that is, a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do a lot of stuff like that." The scripture is not about tithing. Corban, the word, comes from the Hebrew actually, is something brought to the altar, a sacrificial present, an oblation that is offered, particularly to the temple treasury. What it was about in this case was that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were getting the money while the man's parents went hungry. Now, in all I'm going to say here, I'm not talking about Charlene at all. I'm talking in the abstract about the question that she raised. Frankly, if a person is so strapped that he can't pay all of his obligations and his tithe, he has already passed a serious boundary. I am not a part of the tithe police. I don't make rulings on it. But honor your father and your mother is one of the 10 commandments. Then there is this scripture. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. And I recommend that you go back and you read the context of this passage. One of the beautiful things about this Bible study we're doing, at any point in time, you can hit the pause button. You can go look up the scripture in question. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. If any provide not for his own, and specially those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Think about that now. Where are you if you pay your tithe to God and your mom and your dad are going without food? Are you getting any brownie points? Are you gaining any advantage? Is God going to pat you on the head and say, oh, well, you took care of me. I appreciate that. Who cares about your mother and father? I don't think so. According to Paul, you don't take care of your mother and your father or your wife or your kids. You have denied the faith and you're worse than an infidel. Now, if you let yourself get to this place, you're way beyond any question of tithing. The tithe belongs to God, but if you don't take care of your family, tithing isn't going to make up for it. You're going to have to start with a plan to work your way back to where you belong. If I found myself in this pickle, I would take care of my family first. I would ask for God's forgiveness and his forbearance for my lapse. Otherwise, I would recognize that I'm going to pay a penalty for it. Then I would go out and get a second job and start working my way out of the hole I had dug. But as long as we're talking in the hypothetical, is it possible that the reason we're in this hole in the first place is because we haven't honored God with a tithe in the first place? Here's another scripture to jot down. Haggai, chapter 1, verse 4. Is it time for you, O you, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house, my house, lie waste? This is back at a time when the temple, they'd started it and they stopped because of political pressures, and the temple of God was lying there in ruins, and everybody's out there building their own houses and fixing them up and sealing the houses and maybe putting cedar on the walls. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and you bring in little. You eat, you don't have enough. You drink, you're not filled. You clothe, there's nobody warm. And he that earns wages to put it into a bag with holes. And I have a feeling a lot of us know exactly what that feels like. The painful truth is, it isn't our mom and pop that displace the tithe. It's our lifestyle. I got a shock. Allie and I have over the years, she was in real estate for many years, and we have accumulated quite a bit of rental property. And we got a notice from the bankruptcy court concerning one of our tenants. Not that they were going to do anything, but all their debtors and creditors had to be notified. They gave me the whole 9 yards about what this woman had done. The woman, the wife, all single-handedly had run up $42,000 in credit card debt and was declaring bankruptcy. Now, I don't know how you do that. I really don't. I honestly can't figure how you could buy enough clothes, TV sets, rugs for the floor, diapers for your kids, or whatever it is she was spending money on, and running up $42,000 in credit card debts. It's obvious to me that anyone who gets themselves in that kind of situation, the bankruptcy laws are legitimate. I mean, the Bible makes a provision for writing off debts in that situation. But the truth is, you didn't get in that situation because you're paying your tithes. You got into that situation because you were wasting your resources. Personally, I think tithing is both a divine and a natural law. Taking the first tenth out for God teaches us to partition our resources, to divide them up and allocate them, and to reserve part of it for God, and also part of it to leave to our children. I've got an essay on the website, in the Learning Center, on the website titled, The Lost Keys to Financial Security. I recommend it highly to you. You get it by going to the website, dropping down the page in the Learning Center. There's a place for essays, and I think it's on about the second page of essays. The Lost Keys to Financial Security. Now, take a quick break, add a little ice to your tea, and I'll be right back with the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 8. Mark 8, verse 1. In those days, the multitude was getting bigger and bigger, and they didn't have anything to eat out where they were. And Jesus called his disciples and said, look, I feel sorry for these people. They've been out here with me 3 days, and they don't have anything to eat. If I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the wayside, for a lot of them have come a long distance to be here today. You know, we talked about this earlier when he fed a different group of people and asked the question, well, why did he do this? Why didn't he just send them on home? Well, in this particular case, these people had been so enthralled, so wrapped up in what Jesus was doing. Imagine this, about 4,000 of them who are hanging around him, and they don't have anything to eat. They didn't bring any food with them, or if they did, they've already eaten it, long since eaten it, and they're out here in danger of getting themselves in trouble, and they didn't go away. The disciples answered Jesus, where are we going to find anything to satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? And he asked them, well, how many loaves do you have? And they said, well, 7. He had the people all sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them, gave them to his disciples, put them before them, and they passed them out to the people. They had a few small fish, and he blessed them and commanded them to set before the people. So they ate, and they were filled. Everybody satisfied, and they took up the broken food that was left over, 7 baskets full. They that had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Now, a lot of the issues here that kind of converge on this thing. For example, he did this twice with large groups of people. And it does illustrate why he did want to get away into what the King James calls the wilderness and what NIV calls the desert. It's just really a solitary place away from cities, because the kind of thing he was doing, those crowds would absolutely choke a town, a city, to a complete standstill. So he had to get away in order to be able to do anything in terms of teaching these. There are some scholarly sources that say he only fed the multitude once, and that you have these 2 varied accounts of it. Frankly, I don't think it's hard to imagine it happening more than once, given Jesus' popularity. And it was no harder for him to do it the second time than it had been the first time. I think he did it twice. I think he did it at least twice, and maybe he did it more than that, for all we know. And there's one more thing. As I said, there's little question this time as to why he did it. They were in a whole world of trouble if he hadn't done it. Well, straightway, immediately after he sent these people away, he entered into a ship with his disciples and came to the parts of Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees showed up on the scene. They began to question with him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and says, why does this generation seek after a sign? I'll tell you the truth. There shall be no sign given to this generation. You know, in another place where this happened in one of the other Gospels, it mentioned there shall no sign be given to them except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. As the prophet Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. This doesn't have to have been the same occasion. On this occasion, he just says, you're not going to get a sign. Kind of a strange response in a way, though, because Jesus was leaving signs and witnesses of those signs all over the landscape everywhere he went. But he refused to give these corrupt leaders a sign. When he talks about this generation, I think, I don't know that he necessarily means a generation in the sense that we use the word of saying all the people alive today, in this generation. I think he may have been looking at the Pharisees and the scribes as a singular cadre of people, a cohort of people. And to this particular category of people, they are going to be given no sign. He really has a fairly brittle attitude toward these men, and I think with good reason. For one thing, they hated him, and for another thing, they were plotting, probably at this time, his murder. Well, Jesus left them and entered into the ship again and went across to the other side. Now, the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they didn't have in the ship with them more than a loaf. And meanwhile, Jesus said to them, I want you guys, when they got on the boat, they're moving away from the shore with the Pharisees standing there. He says, boy, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, I'm not sure how Herod enters into the picture, but the thing becomes pretty clear when you look at the leaven of the Pharisees, because it is on display the whole time. It would seem to be that the core doctrine of the Pharisees was a kind of legalism. And it's fair enough to say that the very existence of a law is a temptation to legalism, or so it would seem. I know it took me a while to come to understand how the law is to be used lawfully, borrowing words from Paul, and I laid all that out in the book Law and Covenant, which I recommend to you. By the way, it is available for free download in PDF file on rondart.com in the ebooks section. If you want to have a hard copy, I'm sorry, it'll cost you a bit. Personally, I don't like PDF files very much, but they sure make an easy way of distributing information. Anyhow, it's there, and for a more thorough discussion of that, I refer you to that particular place. Well, they reasoned among themselves, saying, I guess he said that because we have no bread. And when Jesus realized what they were saying, he says, why reason you because you have no bread? What gave you that idea? Don't you understand yet? Have you your heart yet hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Don't you remember? You know, do I hear a little exasperation from Jesus on this question? He seems to feel that they really ought to get these things and that they had no real excuse for not getting them. And you know, that might serve as a cautionary story for the rest of us. What are we not getting? Is our heart yet hardened? And how many things are there that are right there in front of our face, as plain as loaves and fish and 4,000 people being fed, that we're going to look at and still not get it? Jesus went on to say, when I broke the 5 loaves among the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They answered, 12. Now, when we broke up the 7 loaves among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They said, 7. Duh, you'd think this is forehead slapping time, wouldn't you? And Jesus said to them, how is it you don't understand? And I have to say, they really do seem kind of dense, don't they? But I also don't think you and I would have been a bit better than they are in that regard. We wouldn't have got it either because we already had our minds made up about so many things that we weren't able to step back and look at this and say, what happened here? What did he do here? What does it mean? Well, if the disciples seemed a little bit obtuse, I think we need to go look in a mirror because we're in the same category. We're the same way. The only reason we understand some of these things is because they finally figured it out or finally were told and finally got it straight, and they wrote it down for us. And I still ask the question, how much is there that we're still not getting that is right there in front of our nose? Well, Jesus came on to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him, and they besought him to just touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town. Now, this is really a strange event, and it really should there should be loads of questions that come to mind on this. He took him by the hand and led him out of town. All they wanted him to do was touch him, and they thought he'd just heal him on the spot. And here's a big question we can ask. Why didn't he? Because he plainly had the power to do it. He could have touched the man. He didn't even have to do that. He could have just said, see, and the man would have started to see. He didn't. He took him by the hand, led him out of the town. Why did he do that? When he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on the man, he asked him if he could see anything. And he looked up and said, well, I see men like the trees walking. So he put his hand again on his eyes and made him look up, and then he was restored and saw every man clearly. And he sent the man away into his house, saying, don't go into town. Don't tell it to anybody in this town. Now, there's something I think important that comes to mind here. It is clear enough to all of us, the question's been asked twice now, and we've talked about it, that Jesus is avoiding the crowds as much as he can. And he is putting off the murderous oppositions that he knows is coming. And, of course, he is also trying to feel free to move about, which the more he's stuck in a town with all the people crowding around and all the events, it could have been a mess. But I think there's more than this. Jesus is demonstrating his power over sin and the results of sin before witnesses who can record it and who can testify to it. I think we would do well to ask ourselves about the meaning of his healing? Is there a spiritual significance to his ability to make the blind see? Well, the composer of the great old hymn, Amazing Grace, certainly thought so. And what is the meaning conveyed by this healing and the strange way it took place? It's kind of odd, isn't it? And when Jesus has, in so many cases, healed people instantly, why this two-stage process on this poor fellow? Well, the meaning of it to me is that it kind of sometimes takes time for us to move from where we are to where we need to be. It's true in terms of morality. It's true in terms of overcoming and growing out of difficulties. It's true in terms of healing. Maybe sometimes you are going to be healed instantly. In all my years of praying for the sick people, I think I've had 2 very dramatic healings take place under my hand. Any other healings that have taken place days later, months later, over a period of time, gradually getting better. It's a part of it. And I guess this is here so that we don't come into Jesus saying, Lord, heal me now. And because all of a sudden we're not healed now of our cancer or whatever it is, we think, well, he didn't care and he didn't heal. There's also one other thing about it. The faith of the person who is being healed is very important. And I think sometimes the touching, the laying on of hands, in this case even putting saliva on the man's eye, in another case he stuck his finger in a guy's ears, I think these touchings, these symbolic acts really help the person to understand, or to focus on what's happening here and who it is that's doing it and how it's being done. There are more unanswered questions than there are answers. But I think it's important sometimes that we think about these things. Well, Jesus went out with his disciples into the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and along the way he asked his disciples, "Who do men say I am?" And they said, "Well, John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." This is kind of strange, because John the Baptist, I think what they mean by this is the resurrected John the Baptist is who it is. This is, because Herod certainly thought that. Some others say you're going to be Elijah, because Elijah was supposed to come in the future. And the Jews to this day, I think, look for the prophet Elijah. And he said to them, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter spoke right up and said, "You're the Christ." And Jesus charged them that they should tell no man about him. He did not want that claim being broadcast, not now. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke that saying openly. Now, what is there about that passage you don't understand? I mean, I read it. Makes sense to me. That he's going to suffer. He's going to be rejected by the leadership and the chief priests and the scribes. He's going to be killed. Ooh, that's frightening, but it's what it said. He said it plainly. And after 3 days, he's going to rise again. Well, Peter took him and began to rebuke him. We know from one of the other accounts, he said, "Oh, Lord, this can't happen to you. This is not right." And Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples and rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, adversary. You savor not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men." The problem I think that these guys had is they still were thinking in terms of a messianic kingdom. They were thinking of Jesus putting an army together and throwing out the Romans and reestablishing the kingdom of Israel and the kingship of David's family, the dynasty. This is what they thought was going on, or where they were headed. And it was awfully hard for them to get their mind around what was really taking place. Once again, I ask the question. Jesus told them plainly, and they didn't get it. What has he told you and me plainly that we haven't got? Well, he called his disciples unto him and all the people around him, and he said, "Whoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever will save his life will lose it. Whoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Therefore, whoever will be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, Of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with all the holy angels. What do you think this meant to the people who heard it? For example, Jesus said, let him take up his cross and follow me. What did they think he meant by that? For we already know they didn't really understand that he was going to die, much less did they understand that he was going to die that way. The cross, per se, had not entered into the picture yet. I don't think that. The word was staros in the Greek, of course, which means stake. It's always translated cross because tradition has it that Jesus actually did die on a stake which had a cross beam which made it into a cross. Romans did do that. That particular side of this, I think, is kind of irrelevant, but what is relevant is what Jesus said. He said, you got to take up your stake and follow me. They may have thought he meant you're going to have to pull up stakes and follow me, to use the vernacular. Symbolically, Abraham certainly and literally did that. He was a nomad. He had lived in a tent. When he had to move, he had to pull up stakes and off they go. I think Jesus meant more than that. I think Jesus was looking all the way down to his own bearing of his stake, of his cross, that he had to carry it to Mount Golgotha as far as he was able to carry it to Mount Golgotha. And he turns to each of us, to his disciples then and the people then, and it might as well be us in the crowd. If you're going to follow me, you're going to have to deny yourself, take up your stake, and follow me. Pick up your burden, and let's go. Now, I know what my burdens are. And if you think about it for a while, you know what your burdens are. And there are lots and lots of times we just like to lay it down. Sorry, that's not the way it's going to be. Self-denial is a fundamental principle of the faith. You can't serve God and merely pursue your own interests. In a way, that's what's symbolized by tithing. You can't just spend everything on yourself. You've got to put God first. These are important principles. We should never let ourselves forget them. If you happen to be just tuning in for the first time and you haven't heard everything we said coming up to this day, our custom is to handle related questions to the Bible study we're going through in Mark before we actually get into Mark. And then afterward, we cover the unrelated questions that people are sending in. If you want to send one, feel free. Just drop me an email, ron@borntowin.net, and tell me your question. First one this week comes from Doug Young in San Diego. He says, I'm going through your Minor Prophets series. And for those of you who don't know that, we have an album on the Minor Prophets. I make my way right through every single one of the Minor Prophets, verse by verse. Doug said, you discussed Micah 2 and the wrongful taking of private property. Of course, you're exactly correct that the Kelo versus New London case was a terrible ruling and is yet another sign of us going down the road of ancient Israel. But you said something additional I've been puzzling over. You suggested that people be compensated according to the future value of their land. Now, I probably didn't put that the best way possible because there's no way, of course, that you can know what the ultimate future value of a piece of property is. In the New London case, though, they were planning, if my memory serves, they were going to, this was not merely a matter of using eminent domain to take a piece of property to put a bridge across the river. You know, if that's what they had to do, they have to do it. That's eminent domain. It's allowed for in the Constitution. But in this particular case, they were going to take this property from the man, and they're going to turn it over to developers so they could increase the value of that land and increase their tax base. Now, this was true. If it wasn't the New London case, it was one very similar to it that I was worried about. But here's my issue on this. If they are, here I am, I've got a home on the banks of the Connecticut River with a gorgeous view out across there. And I love my house. I've lived here. My father owned it. He willed it to me. We've been here for generations. And these people want to take my property away from me for the value of a house that's sitting on land overlooking the river, you know, fair market value of what it would have been today. But here's the thing. If they're going to turn this over to developers who are in the process going to turn this into a huge amount of money, I really think they should compensate me at more than the present value of the land, because they're taking away of all the intangibles that they're taking away, because they're taking away a possession of mine. I really think they should pay me more than the present value of the land that I'm sitting on. So in other words, I feel the owner should be entitled to some degree of additional compensation. When you take property against the will of the owner, current market value is just not right. That's why I said what I said. Next one comes from Terry Gray of Wellington, Alabama. Mr. Dart, I'm enjoying the weekly Bible study, and I have a question regarding Genesis 1. I'm a believer in what is called the gap theory, or the ruin reconstruction theory of creation. How do you think this idea holds up compared to the young earth idea and the day as an age idea? Also, do you know of any good books written in recent years that promote the gap theory? No, I really don't, but an internet search should be able to tell you that, and I'm sure if you asked the question on a forum, somebody would pop up immediately with several references that you could look at on that. By the way, if any of you have never taken a look at the CEM and Friends forum, it's a pretty good resource. There are probably 500 members on that forum, and not all of them post all the time. A lot of them just read. But we get a discussion going on things like the young earth, new earth, gap theories, and so forth. You get a lot of different opinions that get advanced on that, and a lot of references and internet links that go out to different places. We've been through it a lot of times, and I think it's a worthwhile resource to go to the forum, ask your question up there, and somebody will come along and give you some suggestions on it, I have no doubt. For those of you who don't know what he's talking about, the idea that the gap theory is that there is a gap between God created the heavens and the earth and then the 7 days of creation that culminated in the Sabbath day, the creation of man, the Sabbath day. And in that gap, there was a rebellion by Satan, and the whole creation was brought to ruin. And that what we read in Genesis 1 is a story of recreation of the world, not the original creation. I don't think either theory can be advanced without problems. I mean, there are problems no matter how you look at Genesis 1. I have a different view of it myself that has kind of grown up over the years. There's just too much hard evidence that the earth is older than 6,000 years. I'm sorry. To me, I have a problem with Archbishop Usher's 6,000 years of human history thing. And in fact, one of the problems is we've already run beyond 6,000 years. So it doesn't seem to me like it's going to work. But nevertheless, I think that issue, we've booted it around forever, and I think the earth is older. I can't support the young earth theory. I'm sorry. But nevertheless, there are different ways of looking at Genesis 1. One of them is the fact that I often get this question, that why is it there are kind of two creation accounts? You have Genesis 1, then Genesis 2, it goes back and looks at it again. I think the reason is that because Genesis 1 is what someone called the creation hymn. I think it's a very, very old, memorized story of creation that was familiar to all these people in this culture. And then Moses includes it as an introduction to the book of Genesis. I don't think it's intended to be a literal account of 7 literal 24-hour days of creation. Sorry. I also don't really think it fits the day and age theory that is loaded with problems. And the gap theory works better, but even so, I think it's an unnecessary complication of what took place in the book of Genesis. I think it's the easiest way to understand it is that everybody understands that the parables of Jesus were fictional accounts used to illustrate a problem, right? What's the problem with Genesis 1 being like a parable? It's a poem, a hymn that is advanced for youth to use, to memorize, to visualize, to glorify the God of all creation. What's the important thing to know? God did it all. That's the important thing. Now, I'll be willing to bet somebody's going to have some more questions on this, and if you send them in to me, I'll be happy to talk about them next time. Another question today from Bill Linton of Greenville, South Carolina. I listened to your rundown on Bible versions, text variations from the weekly Bible study series with interest. What is your opinion of the book, The Original Bible Restored, Ernest Martin, in which he advanced the idea that our modern Bible does not reflect the inspired order of the Bible? I understand there's one or more scholars who plan to publish a Bible with its different order and combination of books, making the total of books 49. Well, I have looked at this, over the years, the question of the origin of the Bible, the origin of the individual books of the Bible, and then, of course, the method by which God has preserved these books for us. And candidly, I have never seen one shred of real evidence to suggest that there is an inspired order of the Bible. Where would you go for it? Where would you find it? Where's the statement that says that all these books of the Bible are placed in an inspired order? I heard Ernest Martin talk about it for years, and I was terribly surprised when Dr. Jim Tabor seemed to buy into the idea, and he's one of those who launched into this original Bible project. And, frankly, it's just not based in good scholarship. What I know about the origin and preservation of the New Testament rules it out. When you get back and you look at the facts in hand of how those books were originally created, how the autographs were done, how they were preserved, how they were handed to us, the vagaries of how they actually got here, and the miracle almost it is a miracle that we actually have them at all, it just doesn't work. I think one of Ernest's peculiar ideas had to do with progressive revelation, and therefore the order of the books was important because he felt that some of the later books corrected things that were in the former books. I'm sorry, I don't buy that at all. For one thing, at one point, Ernest Martin had said that everything Jesus said, which means everything we're reading here, everything that's in the four Gospels, was said under the Old Covenant and does not apply to Christians. Now, there's a novel idea. Nothing Jesus said applies to Christians. Anyhow, James, he thought, was written earlier than Paul's writings, and that Paul had to come along and straighten James out, had to correct the mistakes that James had made. As I say, it was a curious idea of progressive revelation he advanced, but the problem with progressive revelation, and this is, by the way, fairly fundamental to Mormonism, the problem with progressive revelation is that truth is truth whenever it turns up. Therefore, if we learn a new truth today, it will not turn what was truth yesterday into a lie. If what we thought was true yesterday was a lie, it was a lie, which means we can't depend on it at all. The whole theory of progressive revelation is flawed by this one thing. Progressive revelation is fair enough in that we come to understand or things are interpreted or developed beyond where they were originally given, but progressive revelation does not negate or repeal previous revelation. It has to be built on it, or it is wrong. When I was doing my master's thesis, I happened on to a scholar that Ernest Martin had cited in one of his articles. I have to confess, I was shocked to the core because what I saw was that Ernest had taken this man out of context and made him say the opposite of what he was actually saying in the book. And it was no accident. It was deliberate on his part. It had to be, because the book, what the guy was saying in his book was clear as crystal. I will give Ernest this. It's possible that he took that quotation not from the original book, from somebody else's citation of it, but that's not good scholarship. I went back and I looked at the source of what he was citing, and the man was saying the opposite. The quotation, word for word, was correct, but in its context, it was made to say the opposite of the testimony of the original author. You can't do that in scholarship. Ernest Martin may have had a good idea or two, but you couldn't trust his research. To go anywhere with it, you had to track down every citation for yourself to be sure he hadn't misrepresented it. From that time on, I ceased to read his work. It wasn't worth my time. And while I was doing that research, I found he was not the only PhD who did that sort of thing. I was tracking down some of the stuff on the Elohist, Yahwist interpretation of the origins of the Pentateuch. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's the documentary hypothesis. You can look that up on the internet like you can look up everything else. What was interesting was I read a scholar who was citing as an example a particular psalm that he claimed would be Yahwist based upon the number of times the word Yahweh and the word Elohim were used in the psalm. Well, modern Bibles being what they are, and with the tools we got today, I was able to go back and do my own count and see if he was right. He had double the number of Yahwehs that he cited to the ones that were in the original psalm. How did he do that? He quoted another scholar who quoted another scholar, and who knows how the original guy made his mistake. There's a book called Darwin on Trial by Philip Johnson. I really recommend that to you, because he makes the point that scholars have to publish, and they have to publish in the mainstream of current theory, but they have to say something new all the time. And an awful lot of what they published is just clean off the wall. Well, that's it for today. I think I'm running Gary down probably to the end of his recording media. So we'll stop it there, and I will look forward to seeing you again next week. Don't forget, mail to me, ron@borntowin.net.